Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove called her during the Tuesday morning intake review, his voice carrying the specific contempt reserved for people without prestigious residences or family connections to hospital boards. He didn't know yet. He had no idea who was standing 3 feet from him, refilling the 4 pump with hands that moved like machines, steady as surgical steel, while her eyes stayed fixed on the cardiac monitor climbing from 68 to 74 to 81 beats per minute. Megan O'Brien had arrived at Oak Creek Memorial in Denver exactly 7 days ago, transferred from a VA facility in San Antonio where the supervising doctor had written on her evaluation, exceptional clinical judgment. Recommend advanced placement. She carried that evaluation in an envelope and a pair of worn combat boots in locker 47, 3rd floor, staff lockers near the stairwell. The boots were Dana Recondo, size 8, government issue, with Ramadi dust still ground into the treads from a deployment that officially ended 4 years ago but never actually ended at all. The tag was still attached, Senior Chief Petty Officer M. O'Brien, United States Navy. She hadn't opened locker 47 in 3 days. The hospital smelled like every hospital, antiseptic and fear and the particular brand of industrial despair that clung to linoleum floors scrubbed by 4 a.m. custodians. Megan moved through the corridors of Oak Creek's 3rd floor trauma unit like a woman practicing invisibility, her scrubs a neutral blue, her badge clipped to the standard issue lanyard, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it pulled the skin at her temples. 23 years old when she enlisted. 41 now. The math was simple but the years felt heavy in ways she couldn't explain to civilian doctors who measured experience in continuing education credits and peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Hargrove controlled the hospital the way a conductor controls an orchestra, except he only knew 3 notes: condescension, dismissal, and the particular cruelty that comes from never being questioned. At 54, with a medical degree from Duke and a father-in-law who'd held a seat on the hospital board for 22 years, he'd built a career on the assumption that competence and pedigree were synonymous. They were not, but he'd never met evidence strong enough to convince him. It was 6:16 a.m. when the multicar accident arrived. 2 vehicles, for patients, 1 critical. The ambulance radio crackled and dispatch reported ETA 5 minutes, and Megan was already moving, checking the trauma bay, pulling the intubation kit, confirming that the crash cart had full battery, running through the mental protocol that had saved 847 lives in field hospitals across 3 continents. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She was present in a way that civilians could never quite understand, the way soldiers become present when the sound profile changes. The first vehicle hit the guardrail head-on at an estimated 52 miles per hour. Patient A, multiple lacerations, suspected pelvic fracture, alert and oriented. Patient B, head trauma, unresponsive, Glasgow coma scale of 4, pupils fixed and dilated. The type of patient who would have filled her nightmares 15 years ago. Now he was just data to process, vitals to track, a problem with a finite set of solutions. Dr. Hargrove arrived in the trauma bay at 6:52 a.m., coffee in hand, expensive watch catching the fluorescent light. His presence made the air pressure change. The younger residents straightened their posture. The nurses moved with slightly less confidence. He had that power, not the power of knowledge, but the power of hierarchy, which is a different thing entirely and far more dangerous in the wrong hands. He watched Megan establish a second for line, 18-gauge, fluid bolus running wide open, her movements economical and precise. He watched her anticipate that the monitor was about to alarm, the pulse ox dropping, oxygen saturation at 88, and she was already reaching for the ambu bag before the alarm actually sounded. He noticed that her hands didn't shake. But he also noticed something else: when the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, when the monitor beeped in that particular staccato pattern of cardiac instability, her pupils dilated. Her jaw clenched for exactly 1/7 of a second. Her breathing pattern shifted. The fear was there, he thought. Good. Fear meant she understood the stakes. Fear meant she wouldn't do anything too ambitious. Fear meant she would defer to his judgment, and his judgment was all that mattered in Oak Creek Memorial's trauma bay. What he didn't see was the difference between fear and trained response. What he didn't know was that the ventilators sounded identical to the incoming fire alarm at FOB Lagman in Cunha province. What he absolutely could not have known was that Megan wasn't flinching from the trauma. She was flinching from the noise itself, from the involuntary neural pathway that turned mechanical beeping into the sound of rockets incoming, and she was managing that response with the same discipline she applied to every other aspect of her clinical practice. The management was seamless. The effort was invisible. Patient B coded at 7:14 a.m. Asystole. No cardiac rhythm. No output. Dead on arrival, functionally, but the body was warm and the family was waiting and the protocol demanded that they try. Dr. Hargrove took charge of the code, calling compressions, directing epinephrine, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never genuinely questioned his own competence. Megan positioned herself at the patient's right arm and began drawing medications into syringes with steady hands. 1 mg epinephrine for push. 100 units vasopressin. The drugs that might restart the heart or might not, she'd learned long ago that the outcome wasn't within her control, only the precision of the action. Control the process. Accept the outcome. That was the philosophy. The code ran for 14 minutes. Patient B remained asystole. At 7:28 a.m., Dr. Hargrove called it. Time of death. Family notification. Paperwork. The room cleared with the mechanical sadness of a failed resuscitation, and Megan began cleaning the bed, disposing of syringes, wiping down the monitor with bleach-soaked cloth. The smell of antiseptic rose up and replaced the smell of the code, that metallic copper scent of adrenaline and fear and the particular despair of watching someone's last vital sign flatline into history. Dr. Hargrove was still in the room. He watched her work and said, "You were flinching at the ventilator alarms during patient B's initial assessment." Megan didn't pause. The cloth continued moving across the monitor screen. "Yes, sir." Anxiety. Sensitivity to sudden noise, she said. Still no hesitation. Still no defensiveness. Just the statement of fact, delivered in the tone of voice that you might use to describe a weather pattern. Dr. Hargrove smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who'd just identified a weakness and was already calculating how to exploit it. This job isn't for people who get startled easily, O'Brien. Trauma units require nerves. Steadiness. Can you provide that? Megan turned to face him. Her eyes met his for exactly 2.3 seconds before shifting toward the sharps container. "I'm here to work, Dr. Hargrove." "That's not what I asked." "Then I don't have the answer you're looking for." She finished clearing the trauma bay in 11 minutes flat. By 7:42 a.m., the space was ready for the next patient, the next crisis, the next opportunity for someone to fail or succeed based on preparation and luck in equal measure. It wasn't until 11:33 a.m. that the suture work happened. Patient A from the multicar accident, the pelvic fracture turned out to be a stable fracture, the internal bleeding minimal, the patient's major injury a 2-inch laceration on the left forearm that needed surgical repair. Megan was the suture nurse assigned to the case. Dr. Hargrove was nowhere near the OR. This was a minor procedure handled by Dr. Patricia Chen, a third-year trauma resident who was competent but cautious, a woman who'd been trained to follow protocols precisely. The laceration was clean but deep, requiring subcuticular closure and skin approximation. Megan handed off supplies with the rhythm of a person who'd done this 4,847 times before, though her chart showed exactly 287 surgical assists. The discrepancy between the two numbers was something that would have concerned any thorough administrator, had any administrator been paying attention to a transfer nurse's competence level rather than her anxiety response to ventilator alarms. Dr. Chen worked methodically. Megan anticipated every instrument before the request came. When the attending needed the 4.0 absorbable suture, Megan was already holding it at the proper angle. When Dr. Chen needed to adjust lighting, Megan repositioned the overhead lamp by exactly 7 degrees. The entire procedure took 42 minutes. When it was done, the laceration was closed with the kind of precision that would leave minimal scarring, the kind of closure that required not just technical skill but the understanding of tissue planes that came from having worked extensively in military trauma settings where the margin between good outcomes and infections was measured in millimeters and seconds. Dr. Chen looked up. That was exceptional work, O'Brien. Really exceptional. Did you do surgical rotations in your RN program? Some experience, Megan said. What she didn't mention was that the last laceration she'd sutured under fire was on a 23-year-old Marine named Corporal James Kellerman at a forward operating base in Ramadi, December 2009, while mortars landed 340 meters from the surgical tent and the generator ran on fumes and the water for hand washing had been rationed to 2 tablespoons per surgical team member. What she didn't mention was that Kellerman had become a senior enlisted advisor and was probably somewhere in the continental United States right now, alive because of decisions she'd made in 47 seconds under conditions that would have paralyzed most civilian physicians. Back in the staff locker room at 3 p.m., after the shift had wound down and the chaos of morning emergencies had given way to the relative quiet of afternoon rounds, Megan opened locker 47. The combat boots sat on the top shelf, exactly as she'd left them. The leather was creased and weathered, the soles worn unevenly from a gait that had been altered by a shrapnel wound in 2010 that had healed imperfectly and never quite adjusted to civilian walking patterns. The dog tags were tucked inside the left boot, the metal warm even though the lockers were climate-controlled. She reached for them, then stopped. Her hand hovered in the air for exactly 4.2 seconds. Then footsteps approached, and she closed the locker quickly and turned toward the sink. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. He was still holding his expensive coffee, now cold. He'd never bothered to learn anyone's name, she realized. He called people by their titles or their last names or, occasionally, by condescending nicknames that he thought were charming. The way he looked at her was the way a man looks at an employee he's already decided to dismiss. The calculation was already happening behind his eyes. "You work hard, O'Brien," he said. "I can see that. That's commendable. But in my experience, people with anxiety disorders perform erratically under pressure. Sometimes they freeze up completely. I wouldn't want to see that happen to you in a critical moment. The hospital wouldn't want that either." Megan dried her hands on the paper towel dispenser. The machine made a harsh mechanical sound, a whine that lingered in the air after the paper had finished rolling out. "I understand, Dr. Hargrove." "Do you?" "Because I need to know that I can trust the people on my trauma team. Trust isn't something that comes easily to me. You have to earn it." She looked at him directly. Her voice came out steady, measured, calm as still water. "I earned advanced clinical placement from my previous supervisor." "Previous supervisors can be generous with people they feel sorry for," he said. "I don't feel sorry for people. I hold them to standards. The question is whether you're capable of meeting standards I set." He left before she could answer. The locker room door swung shut with a pneumatic hiss, and Megan stood alone in front of locker 47, her hand still holding the crumpled paper towel, her jaw still clenched, her breathing still controlled. The boots remained hidden. The locker room stayed empty after she left it. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects, and the row of steel lockers caught the harsh white glow, turning the space into something clinical, something cold. Megan pushed through the double doors that led back into the main corridor of Oak Creek Memorial, her scrub still damp from the morning wash-up, her jaw set at the precise angle of someone who had learned that any looseness in the muscles of the face was an invitation for the world to read what lived underneath. Monday morning staff meetings happened at 7:15 in the Chief of Medicine's conference room on the 4th floor. The room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of institutional air conditioning, recycled breath from 30 people in a space designed for 12. Megan sat in the third row, back corner, her tablet in front of her like a shield. Around the table, the hierarchy arranged itself with mathematical precision, attending physicians closest to Dr. Hargrove, residents flanking them like courtiers, nurses and allied staff relegated to the periphery. Dr. Hargrove settled into his chair at the head of the table with the ease of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged there. His suit was tailored within an inch of its life, pressed so sharply it could cut glass, and his cufflinks caught the overhead light with the gleam of old money and inherited certainty. He was the kind of handsome that came from generations of people knowing they were handsome, a face that had never learned what it meant to doubt itself. Behind his eyes lived something that resembled intelligence but was actually something far more dangerous, the absolute conviction that he was smarter than the room. He opened his mouth to begin the meeting, and Megan watched his jaw work for a moment before sound came out. His gaze swept across the assembled staff, lingering for a beat too long on Megan before he leaned back in his chair with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll bet anyone here $50, he said, his voice carrying the casual confidence of a man who had never lost a bet he cared to win, that our little transfer nurse quits within 7 days. The words hung in the air like smoke. Megan's hands remained motionless on the table in front of her. She didn't look up from her tablet. She didn't change her breathing. These quiet types never last. Hargrove continued, addressing the room as if he were sharing a profound observation about weather patterns or hospital efficiency metrics. They come in all sensitive and traumatized, thinking they want to make a difference, and then the first time someone raises their voice, they fold like cardboard. Laughter rippled through the room, a specific kind of laughter that always happened in the presence of institutional power. It was the sound of people who had decided that their safety depended on joining the chorus, on proving that they too understood the joke. The residents laughed loudest, performing their allegiance to the hierarchy. 2 of the attending physicians smiled into their coffee cups with the careful neutrality of people who were tired of this but had decided long ago that being tired was less exhausting than objecting. Megan raised her eyes from the tablet. She looked directly at Dr. Hargrove, held his gaze for the exact amount of time it would take for him to recognize that she had heard every word, that she understood the architecture of what he was doing, and that she was choosing her response with the same precision a sniper chooses a target. Then she took one measured breath. Her left eye produced a single tear. 1. Not a welling up, not a cascade, not the kind of emotional overflow that a breaking person produces. Just one tear that traveled down her cheekbone with the deliberation of something planned, something controlled, something that meant something entirely different than what the room assumed it meant. She wiped it away with the back of her index finger. She never broke eye contact with Hargrove. When she spoke, her voice came out like still water, flat and reflecting and somehow deeper than it had any right to be. A man who needs to humiliate others is already on his knees. The room went dead silent. The fluorescent light seemed to hum louder in that silence, as if the absence of human sound had given them permission to be heard. A coffee cup clinked against a saucer somewhere in the back of the room, a sound that in the quiet felt like a gunshot. Hargrove's smile froze on his face for exactly half a second too long before he forced it back into place, but Megan saw the precise moment when his brain registered that something had not gone according to plan. He laughed then, a sound like gravel in a disposer. That's the spirit. Sensitive and defiant. You'll last a week, tops. The meeting moved forward. Hargrove launched into department updates, bed capacity utilization, a new protocol for discharge documentation. But the energy in the room had shifted slightly, the way air shifts when a predator enters a space and every other creature recognizes that the hierarchy has momentarily been questioned. The residents laughed less. The attending physicians took more careful notes. Megan returned her attention to her tablet and did not look at Dr. Hargrove again. But what they didn't know was that Hargrove spent the rest of that meeting thinking about a $50 bet he now desperately needed to win. Tuesday afternoon, Megan stood in the hospital cafeteria with a tray of chicken, rice, and green beans that tasted like nothing because her body had learned long ago that stress and nutrition existed in separate categories. She was on her lunch break, exactly 30 minutes carved out of a 12-hour shift, and she had positioned herself at a table near the window where the afternoon light came through in hard geometric patterns. Hargrove did not arrive at the cafeteria by accident. He moved through the space with the precise trajectory of a man who had calculated exactly where she would be and when, who had decided that Monday's failure required a course correction, who had determined that the bet he now desperately needed to win would not be accomplished through words alone. His 3 resident physicians trailed behind him like remoras following a shark, ready to perform whatever humor he required of them. He approached Megan's table moving with casual unhurry. She saw him coming with the part of her brain that had learned to track threats in populated spaces, but she did not react. She continued lifting a bite of chicken to her mouth. She did not tense. She did not prepare. Which was why the collision, when it came, had all the appearance of genuine accident. Hargrove's shoulder caught the edge of her tray with what looked like complete circumstance. He was walking and gesturing to make a point to his residents, and the tray simply happened to be in the trajectory of his movement. The physics worked. The narrative worked. Except that narratives built on precision don't rely on accident, and Hargrove moved like a man who had practiced the exact angle required to achieve maximum impact. The tray left her hands. It rotated through the air with the particular helplessness of objects in free fall, and Megan watched it with the portion of her brain that had learned to document disasters. The rice scattered across the tile floor in a white constellation. The green bean scattered in a different pattern. The chicken hit at an angle and slid. The sound of the ceramics striking the floor echoed across the cafeteria. The space went quiet for a moment, not the profound silence of the conference room, but the smaller silence of people pretending not to notice something that required active effort to ignore. Clumsy, Hargrove said. He said it just loudly enough that the nurses 2 tables over would hear it. He said it with the practiced tone of someone delivering a line they had spoken many times before. His residents laughed on cue, the sound of people performing allegiance. Megan set down her fork on the table. She stood up. She moved to kneel on the tile floor without asking for help, without making any gesture that could be interpreted as weakness or distress or anything other than simple practical response. She began to gather the scattered rice with her hands, picking individual grains up from the floor with methodical precision. She could feel eyes on her back, the careful eyes of staff members who understood that they were watching a test, that something was being determined in this moment that mattered. Hargrove remained standing, watching her work. His residents remained standing with him, a small mob of amplification. She did not speak. She did not look up. She gathered every grain of rice, every green bean, the pieces of chicken that had fragmented when the plates struck tile. She deposited them in the ruined tray with hands that remained perfectly steady. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when she turned to face the cafeteria, and she saw the recognition in the eyes of several people that what they had witnessed was not a defeat but something far more dangerous than defeat, the complete and utter refusal to break. Later that evening, alone in her car in the parking lot, her hands finally shook. She gripped the steering wheel and let them tremble for exactly 4 minutes, watching the way her knuckles went white against the black leather, understanding that this was the price of composure paid in private. She pressed her forehead against the wheel. She let one breath escape that sounded like something had cracked inside her. Then she straightened up. She put her hands in her lap. She waited until the shaking stopped. The next 5 days followed a pattern that Hargrove had clearly designed with strategic precision. He was not simply a bully, he was someone who understood that humiliation worked best when it was consistent, when it was witnessed, when the target could never quite predict the form it would take. He asked her in front of the attending physicians why she had not completed a medication inventory that she had in fact completed, then walked away before she could answer. He assigned her to the most difficult patient room at the end of a shift when everyone else had already left for the day. He made comments about her attention to detail during rounds that were designed to undermine her credibility without crossing the line into anything that could be formally documented. On day 5, the architecture of his humiliation reached what he clearly believed would be its culmination. Megan was in the ICU hallway when it happened. She was carrying a file of patient charts back to the nursing station, moving with the efficient stride of someone who had learned to conserve energy and motion. The hallway was populated with enough staff that witnesses would be present, but not so many that the action would feel like a public spectacle. Hargrove had selected the moment with care. He came toward her from the opposite direction, his posture the kind of casual that always preceded something calculated. As they passed, he reached out and knocked the file of charts from her hands. The paper scattered across the tile floor in a cascade that seemed to take longer than it should have to complete. They fluttered and skated and settled in a chaos of documentation. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. The word sweetheart carried an edge that had nothing to do with affection. "Filing's more your speed than critical care." His voice had the confidence of someone who believed he had finally identified the precise pressure point that would cause her to break. The residents he had positioned down the hallway were watching to see if this would be the moment. The other nurses, who were suddenly very focused on their tasks, were watching. Even the patients' families passing through understood that something was being determined in this corridor. Megan crouched slowly. She began to gather the charts with methodical precision, each page retrieved and set aside before reaching for the next one. Her hands remained steady despite the fact that her neck had developed a small flush of color that traveled up from her collarbone, despite the fact that her breathing had changed in a way that only someone trained to read such things would notice. She gathered every page. She organized them into order using only the chart numbers and the date tabs at the bottom of each sheet, working with the quiet competence of someone who understood that perfection in this moment was itself a form of resistance. When she had assembled every single page, she stood. She held the reorganized stack out toward Hargrove. She spoke quietly, her voice pitched to carry only to the people immediately nearby. "Cruelty is the refuge of the incompetent, Doctor." His jaw tightened. The muscle moved visibly along the side of his face, the involuntary response of someone whose confidence had just been punctured. He took the charts from her without responding because he had finally understood that she would not provide him the emotional response he required for the narrative he was constructing. That evening, Hargrove returned to his office and made 4 phone calls. The first was to a board member who owed him a favor. The second was to the nursing agency that had placed Megan, and he asked very carefully whether they had verified her background and her clinical history, implying through tone and suggestion that there might be questions about her credentials. The third was to a retired investigator he knew from a country club connection, asking if the man could quietly look into her employment history and find any discrepancies that might justify a formal review. The fourth call was to himself, a private moment where he sat in his office and understood with crystalline clarity that he had met someone who would not be broken by conventional means, and that this fact had become intolerable to him. The suture tray gleamed under the surgical lights as Megan steadied her hands, muscle memory taking over. James Kellerman lay sedated on the operating table, a 52-year-old contractor with a laceration that had split his forearm open during a security detail in Denver. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that should have mattered. Just a routine procedure requiring careful restoration of muscle and nerve, the kind of work that separated competent nurses from excellent ones. She had already begun the first pass when she felt it, the sudden grip of Kellerman's fingers around her wrist, sudden and deliberate, his eyes snapping open despite the anesthesia that should have kept him under for another 90 minutes. The monitors beside him showed his oxygen saturation holding steady, his heart rate climbing from the pharmacological ceiling she knew shouldn't exist. He was awake. Cognizant. Moving with purpose. Megan's breath stilled, but her hands did not. She continued the suture with the same precision, the same fluid confidence, even as Kellerman's grip tightened on her wrist bone. The tendons in his forearm tensed like rope. His voice, when it came, emerged as barely more than a whisper through the oxygen mask. "That's a couple running stitch," he breathed. His eyes met hers directly, and in that moment, Megan understood with the clarity of a defibrillator shock what had just happened. He knew. Not suspected. Knew. "You're not just a nurse. You're a combat medic." The room tilted. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like cicadas in summer heat, and Megan felt the precise moment her entire remaining life at Oak Creek Memorial became a countdown. She pressed her index finger to her lips without breaking the suture, her movement economical and absolute. The gesture said everything: silence. The finger said, "Not here." The steady hand said, "I understand what you're offering." Kellerman's grip released. His eyes closed. His body relaxed back into the shallow sedation the anesthesiologist had maintained, and Megan completed the repair with 17 more passes, each stitch identical to the last, each one executed with the kind of precision that came from field hospitals in Ramadi, from operating under mortar fire with nothing but flashlight and trauma shears and the absolute knowledge that this person would either walk again or spend the rest of their life remembering they couldn't. The suture line was flawless. Textbook closure. The kind of work that would make any surgeon's hand tremble with inadequacy if they tried to replicate it. She was still trembling when the patient rolled into recovery. Not from fear. From the realization that the clock had just started ticking, and she had no idea how much time remained. The morning after Kellerman's surgery, Megan arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 5:41 a.m., 43 minutes before her shift officially began. The parking lot stretched empty and dark, mountains visible in the distance like the silhouette of sleeping giants. She had not slept. She had spent the night staring at the ceiling of her apartment, replaying the moment over and over, analyzing the micro-movements of Kellerman's face, the pressure of his grip, the weight of those 5 words that had changed everything. "That's a Kabul running stitch." Nobody outside of Special Forces Medical would know that term. Not the Red Cross. Not civilian EMTs. Only people who had worked in the forward surgical teams, who had learned to operate on human beings with artillery thundering outside canvas walls, who had memorized suture patterns that could hold under the worst conditions imaginable. The locker room was still empty when she arrived. She spun the combination lock, right, left, right, the numbers falling into place like a heartbeat, and opened the metal door. Her spare uniform hung on the top hook. Her name badge was on the shelf. And below, carefully wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, the pair of worn combat boots remained exactly where she had placed them 6 months ago. The leather was cracked from the heat of Ramadi. One heel bore a mark from a ricochet. The laces had been replaced 3 times. She stared at them without touching anything. The shift began at 6:19 a.m. in the normal way, report, assignments, the quiet competence of a surgical floor waking up. Megan was assigned to trauma recovery, which meant monitoring post-operative patients, changing dressings, managing pain protocols with a kind of efficiency that had become her signature. She had developed a reputation as the nurse who never panicked, who anticipated problems before they manifested, who moved through the ward like someone who had seen worse and understood that her composure was itself a form of medicine. But everything was different now. Every interaction felt like standing on thin ice, waiting for the crack. Kellerman was in recovery 4, still groggy from anesthesia, his forearm wrapped in pristine gauze. His chart showed excellent vitals, no signs of infection, pain controlled. Megan checked his for line, reviewed the surgical notes, and was about to leave when his eyes opened and found hers. He did not try to speak. He did not attempt any signal. He simply held her gaze for 3 full seconds, and in that moment, communicated everything. "I know. I won't tell. Now you know I know." Then he closed his eyes again and drifted back toward sleep. Megan moved to the next patient. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. But inside her chest, her heart was moving through arrhythmias that no monitor would ever catch. By noon, she had checked on Kellerman 4 times, more than her protocol required. By 2 p.m., she had reviewed his chart 6 times. The compulsion to verify that he was still there, still quiet, still keeping the silence he had promised, had begun to feel like mania. She was monitoring a man she was supposed to be monitoring anyway, but the psychological weight had transformed routine work into something that felt like diffusing an explosive device while blindfolded. The afternoon shift brought Dr. Hargrove through the recovery ward during rounds, his white coat crisp and expensive, his demeanor the particular kind of arrogance that came from 40 years of institutional protection. He moved past Megan without acknowledging her, which had become standard protocol since the cafeteria incident 3 days prior. She had become the kind of person he looked through rather than at, a minor irritant he had decided would eventually remove herself from his orbit, freeing him from the exhaustion of maintaining his narrative. He would be wrong. That knowledge was the only thing keeping her breathing normally. At 4:15 p.m., Dr. Hargrove called her into his office. The space smelled like furniture polish and old money, everything ordered according to a hierarchy that seemed to value appearance above function. He did not invite her to sit. "I'm reviewing your assignments," he said, not looking at her directly. "I'm making some adjustments to scheduling. Effective tomorrow, you'll be reassigned to the general medicine ward. Night shift." Megan's voice remained level. "I have seniority on surgical recovery, doctor." "You do." He turned a page in a file that he had clearly prepared for this conversation. "Which is precisely why this transfer is being made at the director's discretion rather than through normal channels. You'll start nights tomorrow at 11 p.m. Night shift." The worst rotation. The punishment shift, where understaffed wards dealt with chronic patients and emergencies, fell to whoever was standing nearest to the phone. It was designed to break people, to exhaust them through circadian disruption, to make them choose other employment. He was tightening the noose. She could feel it. Is there a clinical reason for this transfer? Megan asked. Hargrove's eyes finally met hers, and they carried the particular coldness of a man who had just solidified a decision. No. The reason is that I've made some calls about your background. I've learned that the nursing agency you listed as a reference has no record of you working there. That's fraud on a credentials application. It's also a state licensing violation. I'm initiating a formal review process. The transfer to night shift is precautionary. While the investigation occurs, I think it best you work in a less critical environment. The room held its breath. Megan understood in that moment that the strategic phase of Dr. Hargrove's campaign had begun. He had moved from public humiliation to institutional sabotage. He had weaponized the system itself against her. She did not flinch. She did not show the fear that was currently flooding her bloodstream like cold salt water. Her voice dropped an octave, a shift so subtle that only someone trained in reading people would have noticed it. The agency listed is legitimate, Doctor. All of my credentials are current and verified. If you have concerns, I suggest you speak to HR directly rather than manufacturing evidence. Hargrove's expression shifted. He had expected fear or anger or tears. He had not expected calm, direct assertion. The absence of the emotional response he craved seemed to irritate him more than any confrontation. Your shift starts at 11 p.m. tomorrow, he said, turning back to his paperwork as if she had already left. That will be all. She walked out of his office and directly to the locker room, locked herself in a stall, and allowed herself exactly 90 seconds of controlled breathing. Her hands, when she looked at them, were rock steady. But her thoughts were fragmenting like a pattern of cracks spreading across windshield glass. Kellerman knew. Hargrove was starting to move against her. And she had exactly 6 days before the general was scheduled to arrive with his security detail and his FBI investigation flag and his need for a trauma surgeon who wouldn't refuse him. The truth was worse than she had allowed herself to think. She wasn't running from her past anymore. Her past was running toward her. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as the 4-star general collapsed in the Oak Creek Memorial lobby at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, his body hitting the marble tile with a sound like a tree falling in an empty forest. His breathing came in gasps, shallow and panicked, his chest heaving against ribs that no longer expanded properly. The security guard called code blue. The overhead intercom crackled with the announcement. Nursing staff converged like trained organisms, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had rehearsed this dance 1,000 times. The stretcher arrived in 47 seconds. They wheeled him toward Trauma Bay 3, his uniform catching the light, dress blues with insignia that meant something to people who understood rank and command. 3 attending physicians arrived within minutes. Dr. Marcus Hayes glanced at the intake sheet, read the name, read the FBI flag notation stamped in red across the patient history. War crimes testimony. Allegations. Federal investigation. He stepped back from the gurney. Not mine, he said quietly to the resident beside him, then turned and walked to the cafeteria. Dr. Sarah Winters read the same notation and her jaw tightened. She knew the reputational cost. She knew what happened to doctors who treated controversial patients in an era of social media and institutional liability. She excused herself to take a phone call that didn't exist. The third physician, Dr. Gerald Okonkwo, stood at the bedside for exactly 8 seconds, watching the general's oxygen saturation drop from 94 to 82 to 71, watching the neck veins distend like rope beneath skin, watching a man suffocate while medicine stood outside the door. Then he too found reasons to be elsewhere. The general's breathing stopped. His lips began to turn the color of slate. Megan was at the supply station restocking trauma kits when the intercom announced the code, and her body moved before her mind caught up. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own. She was in Trauma Bay 3 in 18 seconds, moving past the 3 absent physicians like they were furniture. The general's eyes were wide, conscious, terrified, the look of a man who had survived 3 tours in Ramadi only to die in an American hospital while doctors watched. She didn't ask permission. She didn't check a chart or wait for orders. She moved to his side, assessed the breath sounds, silent on the left, and recognized what she was seeing before the monitor confirmed it. Tension pneumothorax. The lung had collapsed. Air was trapping in the chest cavity, compressing his heart. 3 minutes without treatment meant cardiac arrest. 2 minutes after that, death. She pulled an 18-gauge needle from the trauma tray with movements precise as a surgeon's, found the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, felt the anatomical landmarks beneath her fingers like reading braille. 1 breath. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping sounded like relief. The general's body convulsed once, then his breathing resumed, shallow but present. His oxygen saturation climbed. 71, 74. 79, 84. She placed the needle catheter, secured it with tape, and moved to the central line set up without a word. A resident tried to take over. She didn't step aside. "Call Dr. Okonkwo back. Tell him the patient is stable," she said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone giving orders, not requests. The resident's eyes widened at her tone, but he moved to comply. Within minutes, the general was sedated, intubated, and stabilized on the ventilator, the kind of recovery that should have felt like victory but tasted instead like ash, because it meant staying, meant commitment, meant putting her name in the chart as the nurse who had saved him. It meant tying herself to this patient and his complicated history. It meant everything her past had trained her to do, and everything her present had taught her to avoid. She didn't leave his bedside. Not for 6 hours. Not for 12. The night shift arrived and Megan was still there, adjusting his sedation drip, monitoring his chest tube output, replacing the 4 bags with movements so practiced they looked like choreography. The second night came. She was still there. 17 hours now without food, without water beyond a few sips she didn't swallow, without leaving the bedside except to use the bathroom in the patient's private restroom so she never lost sight of him through the glass partition. She documented every vital sign change in the chart with handwriting that grew more careful as her exhaustion deepened: blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, ventilator settings, sedation levels. At hour 19, the ventilator alarmed. The screen showed a pressure alarm, then a disconnect warning. Megan's hands moved. She checked the connections, intact. She checked the tube, patent. The machine itself was failing. The hospital engineer was in the operating room on a surgical case. The backup ventilator was being cleaned in the equipment room and wouldn't be ready for another 8 minutes. Megan didn't wait. She grabbed the ambu bag from the crash cart, positioned it at the endotracheal tube, and began manually bagging the general with steady, metronomic compressions, inflate, release, watching his chest rise and fall with each squeeze. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5 minutes. Her arms began to burn, but her pace never wavered. Nurses brought her water she didn't drink, a sandwich she didn't eat, coffee that grew cold on the bedside table. She bagged him for 127 minutes total until the backup ventilator arrived and the engineer could reconnect him. When it was done, she set the ambu bag down and noticed her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the restraint it took not to collapse. She sat back down in the chair beside his bed and continued her vigil. The room had one small window facing east, and she watched the sky change color twice, sunset to night to dawn, without moving except to adjust medications and check lines. At hour 22, a nurse tried to relieve her. Megan waved her away. The supervisor came by at hour 23 to suggest she take a break, go home, return refreshed. Megan didn't respond. She was reading the general's file now, the parts that weren't redacted. His name was General Robert Ashford. For stars. Special Forces Command. The FBI notation mentioned testimony in a war crimes investigation, allegations that during his command in Ramadi in 2009, certain detainees had been treated in ways that violated international law. The charges were unproven. The investigation was ongoing. The hospital had decided he was toxic. Megan understood that calculus perfectly. She understood why the physicians had walked away. She also understood that none of it mattered. His history was his history. His future was flat on this bed with a tube down his throat, dependent on a stranger to keep him alive. She would keep him alive anyway. At hour 24, at 2:44 a.m., the security desk called up to Trauma Bay 3. Dr. Hargrove was on his way. He arrived with 2 security officers and a hospital administrator whose name badge read Patricia Nguyen, Director of Nursing Operations. Megan didn't stand. She didn't acknowledge them. She continued adjusting the ventilator settings, checking the chest tube, documenting the latest vital signs in the chart. Dr. Hargrove's voice came from the doorway, steady and official and carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had already made his decision before he arrived. Nurse O'Brien, you are removed from patient care effective immediately. You are suspended pending investigation into credential fraud, practicing beyond the scope of nursing license, and insubordination. Megan's hands didn't stop. She continued bagging the general's medications into the 4-line, her fingers steady on the syringe, her eyes on the monitor. He'll die if I stop, she said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of medical fact, delivered in the tone of someone who had stated medical facts under fire. Hargrove nodded to the security officers. They moved toward her with the careful approach of men trained in restraint but committed to the action. Megan let them come. She didn't resist. She stood and stepped away from the bedside with her hands open at her sides, and one of the security officers immediately took her position, reaching for the 4 medications with shaking hands. Another nurse arrived from the station to take over the monitor, a younger woman named Jennifer who looked at Megan with something like pity and something like understanding. At the security desk on the 1st floor, Megan's ID badge was removed from her scrubs. The laminated card with her name and photo, the nervous, careful photo from her first day, was scanned and flagged as suspended status. She signed the suspension paperwork in silence, her signature barely legible, her hand moving through the motions without connection to the rest of her body. The administrator explained her rights and the appeal process. Megan heard none of it. She walked out of Oak Creek Memorial at 3:56 a.m. still wearing her scrubs, blood-stained at the cuffs, the name badge indent still visible on her chest where her credentials had been. The VA hospital waiting room was across the street, its fluorescent lights bright and impersonal and full of the kind of quiet that comes from shared trauma. 7 veterans occupied the mold plastic chairs, a man with a prosthetic leg reading a 3-month-old magazine, another with a 1,000-yard stare of untreated PTSD, a woman in a wheelchair with an empty left sleeve. Megan sat down in the last available chair. A man 2 seats over wore a faded Ramadi battalion patch on his jacket. She stared at it for a long time. An intake form appeared in her lap at some point. One of the volunteers had placed it there, asking for her name, her age, her service record. She held a pen above the blank line labeled military service, branch, rank, years. The pen hovered there for a long time. Senior Chief Petty Officer. 12 years. 3 tours. 2 Bronze Stars. A Purple Heart. The Navy Cross. All of it true. All of it real. All of it belonging to someone who had died in Ramadi when the helicopter went down, and this woman in blood-stained scrubs was just the ghost they'd left behind. She couldn't write it. She set the pen down and set the form down beside it, and she put her head in her hands while the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song and the rain began to fall outside, hammering the parking lot like someone trying to break through glass. The rain stopped at 3 a.m. Megan sat in the VA waiting room with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned white, the intake form still unsigned on the plastic chair beside her. Around her, men in various states of fracture, some missing limbs, some missing the ability to sleep, some missing words entirely, waited in the fluorescent hum for someone to tell them they could be fixed. She couldn't write it down. Not yet. Maybe not ever. At 6:11 a.m., Her phone rang. Dr. Hargrove's voice came through like gravel in a blender. "Ms. O'Brien, I've retained outside investigators. Board-certified forensic credentialing specialists. They'll be reviewing your entire surgical history, your training documentation, and your clinical competencies." His breathing was steady, which meant he was smiling. "Your credentials appear to exceed standard civilian nursing qualifications. We need to understand where exactly you received this training." The line went dead. She understood immediately. He was building a paper trail to justify her removal. Not suspension, erasure. By 9:15 a.m., security had her badge. The same officer who'd escorted the drunken contractor out 3 months ago looked genuinely uncomfortable as he took it from her hands. "I'm sorry, Ms. O'Brien. Orders came from administration." She nodded once. Didn't argue. Didn't flinch. Just walked out of the general's room one final time, leaving the monitor beeping its steady rhythm behind her like the sound of a life she couldn't save legally anymore. The investigators came that afternoon with notebooks and a list of questions that felt like trapdoors. "Where did you train in emergency needle decompression? Your technique in the general's case was unorthodox." She'd sat across from them in a windowless HR office while Dr. Hargrove lingered in the hallway beyond the glass, watching. She gave them nothing but the bare facts on her civilian nursing certification and said, "I learned needle decompression in my nursing program. That's standard clinical training." They didn't believe her. Their skepticism hung in the air like cigarette smoke. They knew she was lying by omission, they just couldn't prove what she was lying about. She'd walked home in the rain that evening, and the next morning she'd walked into the VA at dawn with the intake form still unfinished in her bag. 3 days passed in a kind of grey fog. She attended a mandatory psychiatric evaluation that felt designed to prove her mentally unfit. She sat with a therapist who asked if the hospital sounds triggered her trauma responses. She didn't answer. On the 4th morning, at 10:33 a.m., everything changed. The emergency room entrance at Oak Creek Memorial exploded into controlled chaos as Rashid Al-Kuwaiti was wheeled through on a stretcher, his 10-year-old son running alongside him while EMS barked vitals into the radio. 62-year-old male, acute atrial fibrillation, rate 187, respiratory distress, ETA 2 minutes. Rashid's heart was misfiring like a diesel engine trying to run on gasoline. The cardiologist on call was Dr. Brenner, competent, by the book, the kind of physician who followed protocols and never asked questions. They moved him to cardiac care, got him on a monitor, started and fought with the mechanical precision of a practice team. 2 nurses, 1 physician assistant, the attending cardiologist. Standard code blue preparation. Rashid's son waited in the family room down the hall, holding a folder with his father's insurance paperwork and looking like he was about to break into pieces. Megan wasn't there. She was at home, drinking cold coffee and staring at the ceiling. At 10:56 a.m., Rashid's eyes opened and focused. The medication wasn't working, his arrhythmia was worsening. The monitor showed an erratic rhythm that looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. And then he heard the voice of the charge nurse walking past in the hallway, calling another nurse for a medication cross-check. The voice was unmistakable, the same voice that had operated on him in a prison hospital in Baghdad while mortar fire rattled the windows and shrapnel hummed through the air like angry hornets. Rashid began to shout. Not from pain. From recognition. The ghost of Ramadi. The ghost of Ramadi, she saved my life in the prison hospital. His hands gripped the bed rail so hard the metal groaned. The ghost of Ramadi, she is here. Dr. Brenner looked confused. The nurses exchanged glances. One of them actually checked Rashid's medication, thinking perhaps the sedatives were causing delirium. But Rashid kept shouting, his voice cracking with a kind of desperate joy that made no medical sense until the hallway fell absolutely silent. A small boy appeared in the doorway. 10 years old, dark eyes, holding his father's hand with the grip of someone who'd learned young not to let go of the people he loved. He looked at Rashid's face, then at the medical staff, then directly at the charge nurse who'd just walked past. That is Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, the boy said in careful, schooled English. My father says you are Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien. From Ramadi. From the prison hospital during the siege. The charge nurse's name was Jennifer. She'd been working the same floor as Megan for 3 weeks and had never questioned a single thing about her. She stepped backward as if Rashid had just spoken a language she didn't understand. Rashid's son stepped forward. He held out a medical file folder. My father wishes to be treated by Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien. Or we go to another hospital. The boy's English was better than his father's, refined with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to survive by communicating perfectly. My father says she is the only physician he trusts with his life. Jennifer made a call. Not to security. To the VA hospital across the street. Megan arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 11:19 a.m., still wearing the same scrubs from the previous shift, still carrying the weight of suspension in her shoulders. She was supposed to be unemployable. Instead, she walked into a cardiac care unit that went silent the moment she entered. Rashid's eyes filled with tears when he saw her. Real tears. Not from pain but from relief so profound it looked like a man drowning finally feeling solid ground beneath his feet. His son stood straight and saluted her, a child's version, but sincere. The gesture came from having watched his father salute only a handful of people in his life, and meaning it every time. Senior Chief, Rashid said. His accent was thick but his gratitude was crystalline. You came back. She didn't answer with words. She simply walked to his bedside and began to assess his cardiac rhythm with hands that had done this work in conditions that would have broken ordinary people. Her fingers found his radial pulse, thready, irregular. She looked at the monitor. Atrial fibrillation at 189 beats per minute, the arrhythmia destabilizing further. She looked at Dr. Brenner. One look. That was all it took. We're going to cardiovert, she said. 200 joules. Someone get me a crash cart. But that wasn't even the moment. That wasn't the turning point. The moment came at 11:11 a.m. when a SEAL team leader named Marcus Holloway pushed through the gathering crowd in the hallway. He wore civilian clothes, a blue button-up and jeans, but he moved like a man who'd been trained to move through hostile territory, and his presence made the air pressure change. Behind him came 2 more operators, and behind them came someone in dress whites with 4 stars on his shoulder boards. Rear Admiral James Whitfield. His face was stone. His jaw was the kind that could cut glass. Marcus Holloway stepped directly into the cardiac care unit. He looked at Megan O'Brien and every muscle in his body seemed to relax at once, the kind of relief that only comes when you've been searching for someone and finally found them breathing. This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, Marcus Holloway said. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She earned a Bronze Star for leadership during a 2008 convoy ambush in Fallujah. She earned a second Bronze Star for emergency surgical intervention in 2009. She earned a Purple Heart in 2010 when an IED detonated 12 meters from her position. She earned another Purple Heart in 2011 during mortar fire in Kandahar. And she earned a Navy Cross for pulling 11 Marines out of a burning Humvee under sustained enemy fire in Ramadi. Marcus paused. Every word hung in the air like shrapnel. She earned that Navy Cross while taking fire from 3 different positions. Alone. She pulled out 11 people who would have died otherwise. And I'm standing here now because she carried me out third. The room didn't just go quiet. The room held its breath. Rear Admiral Whitfield walked forward with a precision that suggested he'd planned this moment. Behind him came 2 CNN cameras and a producer with a microphone. He positioned himself directly beside Megan O'Brien while she was still standing at Rashid Al-Kuwaiti's bedside, her hand steady on the monitor controls. I'm Rear Admiral James Whitfield, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, he said. His voice carried through the entire floor. This hospital's chief of medicine, Dr. Harold Hargrove, refused emergency medical treatment to a 4-star general of the United States Special Forces Command. He did this because that general is involved in a classified investigation. And he did this while simultaneously attempting to discredit the nurse who saved that general's life. The Admiral's eyes were the color of a winter Atlantic, and they were absolutely fixed on Dr. Hargrove, who'd appeared in the hallway with his face going white like someone was draining the blood out of him in real time. Dr. Harold Hargrove is terminated effective immediately for violation of medical ethics, for interference with military patient care, and for targeted harassment of military personnel. His medical license is under review by the Colorado Medical Board. Security will escort him from this facility. It took 3 minutes for security to move Hargrove toward the exit. Meghan watched him walk past the crowd of staff members who now refused to make eye contact with him, the same staff who'd laughed when he knocked her tray to the floor. His hands were shaking. His breath came in short gasps. Someone, possibly his own assistant, actually turned away as he passed. By 12:14 p.m., Meghan O'Brien had cardioverted Rashid Al-Kuwaiti's arrhythmia back to normal sinus rhythm on the second attempt. The monitor showed steady, regular beats. Rashid's oxygen saturation climbed from 87 to 94. His heart rate stabilized at 72. By 1 p.m., the hospital administrator had called. By 2 p.m., they'd offered her the position of Director of Trauma Services. By 3 p.m., she'd accepted. The combat boots came out of her locker that afternoon. She carried them upstairs herself and placed them on the shelf behind her new desk. Not hidden anymore. Not pretending to be anything other than what they meant. 6 months later, Meghan O'Brien stood in her office and looked out the window at Denver sprawling beneath the January sun. The 4-star general had survived. Walter Reed had discharged him fully recovered. He'd sent her a letter, handwritten, formal, that simply said, "You honored the code." That's rarer than most people understand. Rashid Al-Kuwaiti's son was interning in the hospital's translation services program she'd created. James Kellerman had started volunteering as a patient liaison for wounded veterans. Dr. Hargrove's tenure at Denver Community College lasted 8 months before the students filed complaints about his behavior. He now worked for a medical billing company in Grand Junction, 250 miles away, making $38,000 a year. His wife had filed for divorce. His children had changed their names back to her maiden name, Dalton, the way they'd wanted to for years. Meghan pulled out the framed photograph from her desk drawer, her old SEAL team, Ramadi, 2009, when she was someone else. When she was the ghost. She looked at her own face in that photo, 26 years old and carrying the weight of 214 Marines in a sector that didn't have a name on most maps. She didn't flinch at the ventilator alarms anymore. Or maybe she'd just made peace with the sounds. Maybe she'd learned that some sounds were life returning, not life leaving. The radio in her pocket crackled. A new admission coming in, multi-vehicle accident on IR-25, 3 patients in critical condition. She clipped the radio back to her belt and moved toward the door with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story of hidden strength and quiet heroism. Leave a comment below. Have you ever worked alongside someone whose true worth went unrecognized? And share this video with someone who deserves to know that the strongest people are often the ones who say the least.